which is the federal database from 1997, unidentified male DNA, but it's 15 markers. And that's at the time, it was the only thing we had. This allows you to do a family tree investigation, and it's huge, and it solved a lot of old cold cases.
Here some foreign DNA was found, but not any family members. That DNA maybe has no forensic value, just have some innocent explanation, get there. It's not the true piece of physical evidence to link somebody or to exonerate somebody.
And I learned recently that yes, you can get this data from a hair sample. We have several hair samples from JonBenét's crime scene that weren't identified. We donated hair and pubic hair. There's a pubic hair sample in JonBenét's blanket, not linked to anybody at this point. We know you can get a sample from that now. I've heard that before, and of course heard it in your program.
Recover from a case sample probably should be ignored. The DNA on the garage is more important. The note, the pen. If they still have the flashlight, it's not too late.
We'd really want to get bolder.
It's cover up something. What to cover up?
For decades, the DNA evidence has been one of the most controversial pieces in the JonBenét Ramsey case. Many investigators who followed the DNA was absolutely meaningless, while the prime suspect in the eyes of so many always insisted DNA could be the key factor. And when everything started spinning out of John's control, people began to realize that the DNA and its suspicious, almost convenient contamination might have been nothing more than John Ramsey's trap. Designed to cover his prior crime against JonBenét, could DNA itself be the ultimate misdirection? The hypothesis that the DNA evidence is a creation of John to cover his prior mistreatment is built upon a prior theory proposed by a former CA analyst, suggesting that Burke inadvertently caused injury to JonBenét, leading him to panic and alert his parents. In response, John devised a cover-up plan, ostensibly to shield Burke, but primarily to safeguard his own hidden secrets. Central to this extension is the idea that John Ramsey orchestrated and promoted the DNA narrative as a deliberate strategy for concealment. A forensic examination would likely uncover signs of prior sensitive mistreatment by John and potentially detect his own DNA, prompting to contaminate the DNA evidence intentionally. It's noteworthy that most events tied to DNA evidence and its contamination directly involve John. For more detail, these specific incidents will be explored in subsequent sections. By selecting DNA as his shield, John capitalized on its appearance as the most robust forensic proof, capable of redirecting the investigation's focus. The ultimate goal was to shift attention away from suspicions of mistreatment and prevent the family, particularly himself, from being viewed as the sole epicenter of scrutiny. In the late 1990s, DNA analysis was heralded as the gold standard of evidence, yet the technology remained rudimentary and fraught with limitations. Samples were often minuscule, highly susceptible to contamination and to degradation, resulting in ambiguous outcomes that frequently faltered under courtroom scrutiny. John, aware of these vulnerabilities, exploited the technological gray areas to transform DNA into a facade of strength, impressive on the surface but inherently fragile. This manipulation allowed him to craft a narrative where inconclusive DNA findings could sow doubt and prolong uncertainty, effectively diluting the weight of other investigative threads. On the other side, other evidence in the case pointed toward multiple individuals, but lacked the decisive strength to implicate anyone conclusively. For instance, the ransom note subtly implicated Patsy as the perpetrator through its stylistic quirks and content. The Swiss Army knife and Maglite flashlight suggested Burke's involvement, given their association with his belongings and activities. The garrote device hinted at both Patsy and Burke, due to its makeshift construction from household items linked to their routines. Inside the suitcase positioned beneath the window, items like a notebook and blanket belonging to John Andrew Ramsey were found, though he was absent from the Ramsey home at the time of the incident. The only fingerprint directly tied to the scene and the event was on Burke's pineapple bowl, yet it fell short of providing definitive conclusions. For the evidence relating to John's prior crime, John Ramsey's interactions with JonBenét often raised subtle red flags among those close to the family, suggesting boundaries that seemed blurred in ways that could indicate inappropriate dynamics. For instance, the former housekeeper, Linda Wilcox, who worked for the Ramseys from 1993 to 1995, recalled in interviews that John kept a framed photo collage of his deceased eldest daughter, Beth, who had died in a car accident in 1992, prominently displayed, including images of her in a bathtub, which Wilcox found unsettling and out of place, especially in areas like the bathroom. Wilcox noted that John had few pictures of his other children, Melinda and John Andrew, around the house, focusing disproportionately on Beth, which struck her as odd and contributed to an atmosphere where familial affections appeared uneven or fixated. Beyond these anecdotal insights, medical and behavioral patterns in JonBenét's life pointed to potential ongoing issues that experts later linked to signs of prior mistreatment. JonBenet visited her pediatrician Dr. Francesco Bioff an unusually high number of times, around 33 visits between 1993 and 1996, including recurrent infections and other concerns that some specialists interpreted as indirect indicators of distress or interference. These frequent medical checkups stood out as more than average for a child her age, raising questions about underlying causes that went unaddressed at the time. Additionally, JonBenet exhibited persistent bedwetting and soiling issues, behaviors that child psychologists often associate with emotional or physical stress, and she required assistance with personal hygiene far beyond what was typical for her age group. Reports from family, friends, and helpers indicated that she would call on adults, including non-family members like Fleet White, to help with wiping after using the bathroom or even changing her underwear, which created awkward situations and suggested a lack of boundaries or training in privacy. White himself confirmed an instance where he assisted in changing her underwear, a detail corroborated by Patsy's sister, Pam Poff, highlighting how such dependencies were normalized in the household, but viewed as unusual by outsiders. Several prominent medical experts reviewed the available evidence and asserted that these patterns aligned with indicators of chronic inference prior to the events in question. Dr. John McCann, a specialist in child genital anatomy from UC Davis, examined the records and concluded there were clear signs of repeated contact that could not be explained by innocent causes like poor hygiene or accidents. Similarly, Dr. Andrew Sirotnak, head of the Child Protection Team at Children's Hospital Colorado, confirmed observations of prior harm during his consultation, emphasizing that the findings pointed to a history of inappropriate contact. A panel of experts convened in 1997 unanimously agreed after reviewing the materials that the evidence supported a pattern of ongoing sensitive mistreatment, ruling out alternative explanations such as urinary tract infections or sports-related injuries. These specialists, drawing from international guidelines like the Adams Classification System for Mistreatment Assessments, maintained that the cumulative signs, beyond any acute incidents, indicated a prolonged issue that had been overlooked. JonBenét's increasing clinginess to her mother in the days leading up, as noted by observers, hinted at underlying anxiety or discomfort that might stem from familial tensions. These elements, pieced together from witness accounts and expert analyses, highlighted a pattern where John's presence in her life appeared intertwined with unresolved questions about appropriateness and protection. For the specific action of John Ramsey's actions on the day JonBenet was discovered significantly impacted the integrity of the crime scene, leading to speculation about whether these actions inadvertently or intentionally obscured critical evidence, particularly in relation to trace materials found. At approximately 1:05 p.m. on December 26, 1996, John, prompted by Detective Linda Arndt to search the house, descended to the basement with family friend Fleet White. There, in a small room referred to as the wine cellar, he located JonBenet, covered partially by a white blanket. Without hesitation, John removed the duct tape from her mouth, lifted her from the floor, and carried her upstairs to the living room, placing her on the floor near the Christmas tree. This immediate and direct physical contact was later criticized by investigators as a major disruption to the crime scene, as it introduced possibility of transferring trace materials, such as fibers or skin cells, from his clothing or hands to JonBenet in clothing. Forensic reports later identified fibers consistent with the black Israeli wool shirt John was wearing that day in the crotch area of JonBenet's oversized underwear and on her labial folds, which some investigators viewed as suspicious, though John's defense argued these were the result of innocent transfer during this moment of discovery. The act of removing the duct tape from JonBenet's mouth was another point of contention among forensic experts and investigators. This action, described in police reports and corroborated by Arndt's observations, potentially dislodged or contaminated any biological evidence, such as saliva or skin cells, that might have been present on the tape. While no DNA from John was identified on the tape, the handling itself could have compromised the ability to collect clean samples, as noted by forensic expert Dr. Henry Lee, who emphasized that such actions can muddy the chain of evidence. The duct tape, a critical piece of evidence, was not preserved in its original state, and John's interaction with it added to the challenges of isolating viable DNA profiles. Furthermore, the white blanket that enveloped JonBenét was disturbed when John lifted her, potentially transferring additional fibers or trace evidence from his clothing. The blanket, frequently washed due to JonBenét's bedwetting issues, was already a potential source of cross-contamination, and John's handling exacerbated the risk of introducing extraneous materials, complicating the forensic analysis. Once upstairs, John's decision to place JonBenét in the living room, where friends and family were gathered, further compromised the scene. The lack of immediate isolation allowed others, including Patsy Ramsey and family friends like Barbara Fernie, who were present in the chaotic environment, to come into contact with the surrounding area. This uncontrolled setting, initiated by John's actions, created a cascade of potential contamination, as noted in investigative reports by Steve Thomas and others. Friends of the family were observed cleaning surfaces, such as the kitchen sink, and moving objects, which further muddled the collection of pristine evidence. While no DNA from John was found on JonBenét, clothing, or associated items like the underwear, leggings, or duct tape, the fibers from his shirt became a focal point. These fibers, identified in the Bonita papers and forensic reports, were explained by John's legal team as a result of his handling of a claim that investigators aren't found suspiciously convenient, though forensic experts like Lee acknowledged that such transfers are plausible in scenarios involving close contact. John's behavior during police interviews also drew attention to how he addressed the presence of these fibers. In 1997 interviews, when confronted about the fibers from his wool shirt in JonBenét's underwear, John suggested they could have transferred during his carrying through incidental contact in the household, such as laundry mixing. This explanation aligned with the defense's broader narrative that any trace evidence linked to John was incidental, not incriminating. However, investigators like Steve Thomas in his book questioned the plausibility of such transfers occurring solely through innocent means, given the specific locations where the fibers were found. The absence of John's DNA on key evidence, such as the underwear where an unknown male's touch DNA, labeled UM1, was identified, or under JonBenét's fingernails, supported his defense but did not fully dispel suspicions, as the compromised scene made it harder to rule out contamination as a factor in the lack of his DNA. When recalling Detective Linda Arndt, the first officer to interact extensively with John that day, expressed in her reports and subsequent interviews a belief that his behavior was not entirely consistent with that of a grieving parent. She noted that John's decision to upstairs, rather than alerting authorities immediately, seemed calculated to some degree, potentially providing a rationale for any trace evidence linked to him. Move to another question of the problem is that how many DNA samples John Ramsey contaminated. The forensic evidence in the case revealed a limited but critical set of DNA samples, none of which directly implicated John Ramsey, though his actions significantly complicated their interpretation. 3 primary DNA samples were identified through forensic analysis. The most prominent was a trace of touch DNA, labeled UM1, unknown male 1, found in a blood spot on JonBenét's oversized underwear, which was tested initially in 1997 and refined by Bode Technology in 2003. This sample, belonging to an unidentified male, did not match John Patsy Burke or any tested suspects, such as John Mark Carr or Gary Oliva. A second sample, also from an unknown male, was recovered from under JonBenét's fingernails, but its low quantity and degraded state suggested possible contamination from external sources, such as autopsy tools or incidental contact, as noted by forensic expert Dr. Henry Lee. The third sample, found on JonBenét's leggings, matched the UM1 profile from the underwear, strengthening the hypothesis of a single external contributor, though experts like Lee and others cautioned that this could be an artifact from manufacturing or handling, not necessarily from a perpetrator. Additional items, such as the Garrett duct tape and white blanket, yielded no viable DNA profiles due to technological limitations or contamination, though the Garrett is under re-examination as of 2025 with advanced techniques, according to Boulder Police Department updates. Back to the most striking detail related to John's actions was his decision to invite multiple friends to the house shortly after the 911 call, creating an environment ripe for further contamination and introducing multiple sources of potential DNA. Immediately after Patsy's 911 call at 5:52 a.m., John contacted close friends, including Fleet and Priscilla White, Barbara and John Fernie and others, who arrived at the home within hours. Subsequent forensic testing revealed the presence of DNA from multiple individuals, though only the U1 sample and the fingernail DNA were distinct enough to analyze. The fingernail DNA in particular was deemed unreliable due to possible contamination from the crowded scene, as noted by experts like Dr. Henry Lee, who emphasized that unsecured environments often yield mixed or degraded DNA profiles. The presence of multiple people increased the likelihood of incidental DNA transfer, such as touch DNA on objects like the blanket or clothing, which complicated efforts to isolate perpetrator-specific evidence. John's decision to call friends to the house was particularly unusual given the circumstances, as the ransom note explicitly warned against contacting authorities or others, threatening harm to JonBenét if the demands were not followed. The 911 call itself, made by Patsy but with John's awareness, was already a risky move in light of the note's instructions. Yet John's subsequent invitation of friends amplified the irregularity. Investigators, including Arndt, found this behavior suspicious, as it seemed counterintuitive for a parent concerned about a kidnapper's threats to invite a group of people into a potentially active crime scene. This action, detailed in investigative accounts and grand jury documents, suggested to some, like Steve Thomas, that John may have been orchestrating a scenario to dilute the forensic evidence pool. By introducing multiple individuals, John inadvertently or deliberately created a setting where stray DNA from friends, such as hair or skin cells, could mingle with existing evidence, making it harder to pinpoint a single source. Online discussions on platforms like Reddit have speculated that this was a calculated move to obscure any incriminating traces, though forensic experts maintain that the resulting contamination was more likely a byproduct of poor scene management than a deliberate strategy. The invitation of friends to the house, combined with the initial 911 call, raised questions about John's intentions, as both actions defied the ransom note's explicit threats. Arndt's reports and interviews, as well as discussions in Foreign Faction by James Kolar, highlighted the oddity of summoning a group to a home under such circumstances, suggesting a possible intent to create a chaotic environment that would complicate forensic analysis. While no direct evidence proves John deliberately contaminated DNA, the presence of multiple individuals introduced variables that muddled the evidence collection process. The fact that so much of the crucial evidence is tainted with John's involvement, and that it largely erases any direct links between John and the Ramsey family members, really makes it impossible to believe that what he seemingly did accidentally was actually a plan. However, one fact can't be ignored: John Ramsey could not have single-handedly contaminated or manipulated the DNA evidence. Too many people were involved in the case at that time. The real question is whether he may have influenced, or even paid off, those around him to help steer the narrative. After all, the problems with the DNA evidence remain unresolved, and to this day the case is still clouded by conflicting opinions and divided perspectives. From the outset, the Boulder Police Department treated John, Patsy, and Burke Ramsey as primary suspects, focusing on their behavior and limited initial cooperation. In 1996 and 1997, investigators from the family and over 200 individuals, including friends, neighbors, employees of John's company Access Graphics, and external suspects. The key DNA evidence included a sample labeled UM1, a touch DNA profile from an unidentified male found in Benét's oversized underwear, identified in 1997 and refined by Bode Technology in 2003. Additional DNA, also from an unknown male, was recovered under JonBenét's fingernails, though its degraded state suggested possible contamination from autopsy tools or incidental contact. The Ramseys' refusal to participate in formal police interviews for 6 months, coupled with their immediate retention of high-profile attorney Lynn Wood, fueled suspicions of obstruction, prompting BPD to intensify their focus on the family while testing DNA against a growing pool of suspects. In 1998, a grand jury was convened to evaluate the evidence, including DNA findings presented by experts like Barry Scheck and Henry Lee. Over 13 months, the jury reviewed forensic reports, witness testimonies, and the UM1 DNA, which did not match John, Patsy, or Burke. Despite this, the grand jury recommended indicting John and Patsy in 1999 on charges of child abuse resulting in death and accessory to a crime, alleging they allowed JonBenét to be placed in a dangerous situation. District Attorney Alex Hunter declined to sign the indictment, citing insufficient evidence to secure a conviction, a decision that sparked controversy and allegations of leniency toward the Ramseys. Critics, including former BPD detective Steve Thomas, argued that Hunter's refusal was influenced by the family's wealth and connections, given John's role as CEO of Access Graphics, a Lockheed Martin subsidiary. The grand jury's findings, unsealed in 2013, revealed their belief that the Ramseys' actions or inaction contributed to the circumstances of the crime, though DNA evidence was not deemed sufficient to either inculpate or fully exonerate them. The Ramseys leveraged these proceedings to access investigation details, which bolstered their public defense through media campaigns emphasizing the DNA as proof of their innocence. The Ramsey family pursued civil lawsuits to counter accusations against them, filing defamation suits against media outlets like CBS and St. Martin's Press for alleging their involvement. In 2002, a federal judge in a defamation case brought by Patsy ruled that the evidence, including the UM1 DNA, was more consistent with an intruder theory than with family culpability, a decision that strengthened the Ramseys' narrative. Their legal team, led by Lynn Wood, and public relations efforts, spearheaded by Pat Korten, heavily promoted the DNA as definitive proof of an external perpetrator, overshadowing other evidence like the ransom note or a bowl of pineapple found at the scene. In 2008, District Attorney Mary Lacey issued a public letter apologizing to the Ramseys and declaring them completely cleared based on the UM1 DNA and its match on the leggings, which she argued pointed to an unknown intruder. This exoneration, however, was met with skepticism by subsequent DA Stan Garnett and former Police Chief Mark Beckner, who argued the DNA's small quantity and potential contamination, possibly from the unsecured crime scene where friends like Fleet White roamed, rendered it legally inconclusive. The letter, lacking binding authority, intensified debates about the DNA's significance and the investigation's direction. Burke Ramsey's 2016 defamation lawsuit against CBS and Dr. Phil further highlighted the family's efforts to control the narrative surrounding the DNA evidence. The lawsuit targeted a documentary suggesting Burke's involvement, and its 2019 out-of-court settlement, with CBS paying an undisclosed sum, reinforced the Ramseys' strategy of using legal action to deflect accusations. Meanwhile, John Ramsey's advocacy for DNA re-examination grew prominent, particularly after Patsy's death in 2006. In 2022, he launched a petition for a PEGThat DNA testing, arguing that BPD's handling was inadequate. By January 2025, John met with Boulder Police Chief Stephen Redfern and DA Michael Dufferty, pressing for genetic genealogy analysis, inspired by techniques used in the Gilgo Beach case. BPD confirmed that the UM1 DNA is a mixed profile, contaminated with JonBenét's blood and traces from at least 2 others, complicating its use in standard databases like CODIS. Ongoing efforts to test unexamined items, such as the Garrett's knots, continue, but progress remains slow, with BPD citing the complexity of degraded samples. The debate over the DNA evidence and its implications for the Ramsey family's culpability has sharply divided investigators, experts, and the public, with distinct camps forming around whether the evidence exonerates John, Patsy, and Burke Ramsey. Lou Smith, a seasoned investigator hired by the Boulder District Attorney's Office in 1997, emerged as a staunch supporter of the Ramsey family, arguing that the unidentified male DNA, called UM1, found on JonBenét's underwear and leggings pointed unequivocally to an external intruder. Smith's intruder theory leaned heavily on this DNA, which did not match any family member or known suspects, and he presented detailed slides to the grand jury to bolster his case. He resigned from the investigation when he felt the BPD unfairly targeted the Ramseys, later becoming a vocal advocate for their innocence in media appearances and interviews. The Ramsey family's legal and public relations team, led by attorney Lynn Wood and spokesperson Pat Korten, amplified Smith's position, aggressively promoting the DNA as definitive proof of the family's innocence. Through press releases, their 2000 book The Death of Innocence, and numerous interviews, they framed the UM1 DNA as evidence that an outsider was responsible, effectively shaping public perception and deflecting suspicion. Their campaign was bolstered by a 2002 federal judge's ruling in a defamation lawsuit, which stated that the evidence was more consistent with an intruder than with family involvement, giving their narrative significant traction. In contrast, several prominent figures in the investigation expressed skepticism or outright rejection of the DNA's exculpatory power, arguing it was either unreliable or insufficient to clear the Ramseys. Steve Thomas, a former BPD detective, was one of the most vocal critics, asserting in his book JonBenét Inside the Ramsey Murder Investigation that the case was not a DNA case. He argued that the UM1 DNA, being a small-touch DNA sample, was likely contaminated, possibly from manufacturing or incidental contact, and did not outweigh behavioral evidence like the ransom note or the family's actions. Forensic pathologist Cyril Wecht echoed this skepticism, stating that the DNA's presence did not rule out family involvement, particularly given the compromised crime scene where friends and family freely moved, potentially introducing extraneous traces. Dr. Henry Lee, a renowned forensic expert, further cautioned that the DNA could have originated from innocent sources, such as factory workers who handled the clothing, and emphasized the scene's contamination as a barrier to reliable analysis. FBI profilers also downplayed the DNA's significance, suggesting that other physical evidence could have been staged to mislead investigators, and focused instead on behavioral clues pointing to family dynamics. Some BPD investigators, as noted in Perfect Murder, Perfect Town by Lawrence Schiller, believed the Ramseys' fixation on DNA was a deliberate strategy to overshadow incriminating evidence, such as the pineapple found in JonBenét's stomach or the flashlight in the kitchen. More on the negative stories surrounding the activities of investigators biased against the Ramsey family. To this day, every time John Ramsey steps in front of the media, his image is tied to DNA. He's pushed it for years as if it were the single piece of evidence that could finally end the case once and for all. But in his most recent appearance, John slipped. He revealed that he doesn't really care about the DNA the way he's always claimed. More than anything, it's becoming clear that DNA has been less about solving the crime, and more about buying him time. In the latest appearance, John Ramsey's public statements about DNA evidence have been riddled with inconsistencies and selective omissions, casting doubt on his sincerity and suggesting he may have knowingly promoted a misleading narrative to deflect suspicion from his family. One prominent example is his repeated emphasis on the unidentified male DNA found in a blood spot on JonBenét's underwear and under her fingernails, which he has consistently hailed as the golden evidence, proving an intruder was responsible. However, forensic experts have challenged the reliability of this DNA, noting its minute quantity and susceptibility to contamination from sources like factory workers who handled the clothing during manufacturing. Henry Lee, in particular, emphasized that touch DNA could originate from innocuous sources unrelated to the crime. Despite these expert opinions, John has ignored the contamination risks and technological limitations of the 1990s, when DNA analysis was less precise, and continued to present the UM1 as the definitive key to exoneration. This selective focus suggests he was aware of the DNA's inconclusive nature, but chose to amplify its significance to shape public perception, knowing that the technology at the time could not definitively link it to a suspect. Another glaring misstatement centers on John's references to a hair sample found in the white blanket wrapped around JonBenét, which he described as like this. That implied it could indicate sexual assault by an intruder. Forensic analysis conducted by the FBI between 1998 and 2005, as detailed in Foreign Faction by James Kohler, revealed this was not what hair John described but an auxiliary hair, likely from the underarm, back or chest, and mitochondrial DNA testing linked it to Patsy Ramsey's maternal lineage, potentially Patsy herself or her daughter Melinda. John's insistence on calling it with a wrong label years after these findings suggests either a lack of awareness or deliberate misrepresentation. Given his deep involvement in the case and access to legal and investigative resources, it is implausible that he was unaware of the FBI's conclusions, which were publicized by 2012. By maintaining this inaccurate description, John perpetuated a narrative that supported the intruder theory, despite evidence pointing to a family member, thus misleading the public and media about a critical piece of evidence intimately tied to the crime scene. John's recent advocacy for whole genome sequencing, highlighted in his 2025 NewsNation interview, further exposes contradictions in his approach to DNA evidence. He described this advanced technology as the only way to solve the case, tying it to the Gilgo Beach case ruling and claiming it could unidentified hair samples from the crime scene. However, his enthusiasm appears calculated, as it coincides with his appearance at CrimeCon 2025 and a Fox Nation series promoting the intruder theory, suggesting a public relations maneuver rather than a genuine scientific pursuit. Critics have noted that John's push for new DNA testing conveniently ignores the fact that the FBI already tested key hair samples, like the one in the blanket, with results pointing to Patsy. Moreover, whole genome sequencing could potentially reveal familial DNA in the crime scene, a risk John never acknowledges in his statements. His selective optimism about this technology, without addressing its potential to uncover inconvenient evidence, implies he knows the DNA may not yield an intruder, but uses it to maintain a favorable narrative, especially as public scrutiny intensifies around high-profile true crime events. The issue of fibers found on the sticky side of duct tape used in the crime further underscores John's selective silence and potential awareness of the DNA's limited value. Forensic reports, as cited in the Bonita papers and corroborated by Steve Thomas, identified red and black fibers matching the blazer Patsy wore on Christmas night, directly linking her to the crime scene. In his public statements, John has consistently avoided mentioning these fibers, focusing solely on the UM1 DNA to bolster the intruder theory. This omission is significant, as the fibers represent concrete physical evidence tying a family member to a critical item, unlike the ambiguous DNA. By sidestepping this evidence, John appears to deliberately steer attention toward DNA, which he knows is less conclusive due to its mixed profile and contamination risks, as noted by BPD and Henry Lee. This selective narrative suggests he understands the DNA's limitations, but uses it as a distraction from more incriminating evidence, reinforcing suspicions that his focus is strategic rather than truth-seeking. John's claim that the Boulder Police Department was reluctant to test DNA also reveals a contradiction when viewed against his legal team's actions. In early interviews, such as those in 1997 with BPD, John and his attorneys, led by Lynn Wood, criticized the police for allegedly refusing to pursue DNA testing aggressively, framing them as incompetent. However, Perfect Murder, Perfect Town documents that the Ramsey legal team itself objected to destructive testing of the so-called, as what John described in the blanket, during the initial investigation, insisting it should only be tested when a suspect matched other evidence. This stance delayed critical analysis and contradicts John's public narrative that the police were solely responsible for stalling DNA progress. By blaming the BPD while his own team impeded testing, John created a misleading impression of his commitment to DNA evidence, suggesting he knew its results might not support his narrative and preferred to control the timing and scope of forensic analysis. John's explanation for the potential presence of familial DNA at the crime scene further highlights his strategic manipulation of the DNA narrative. In interviews, such as those with BPD in 1997, he dismissed any Ramsey DNA or trace evidence, like fibers from his shirt found in JonBenét's underwear, as resulting from innocent contact, such as picking up her or Patsy's emotional embrace. He has argued that, of course, our DNA is there, due to these interactions, providing a ready excuse for any familial traces. Yet, in public statements, he avoids discussing this possibility, instead emphasizing that the UM1 DNA doesn't match the family, creating a one-sided narrative that only highlights exculpatory evidence. This dual strategy, ignoring familial DNA publicly while having a preemptive defense, suggests John is aware that DNA could implicate his family but uses it as a double-edged tool to dismiss suspicion when it suits him, when to explain away incriminating findings if they arise. This approach, as noted by Steve Thomas, allows John to maintain flexibility while promoting an intruder-focused story. Additional inconsistencies arise with John's handling of other hair samples, such as those found in a suitcase under the basement window, which he has referenced vaguely as part of the unidentified evidence supporting an intruder. While some hair samples from the crime scene were not immediately identified, forensic reports indicate that most were either inconclusive or linked to the family, such as the auxiliary hair tied to Patsy. John's selective focus on these hairs, without acknowledging their tested outcomes, mirrors his misrepresentation of the blanket hair. By highlighting only the DNA and hairs that fit the intruder narrative, he sidesteps evidence that could point to the household, as discussed in Foreign Faction. This pattern suggests he knows the DNA and hair evidence may not lead to an external suspect, but continues to leverage them to maintain public support for his innocence. Back to the early years following the tragedy, John Ramsey's public statements and media appearances showed a noticeable lack of emphasis on DNA evidence, with his focus instead directed toward other aspects of the investigation that supported his narrative of an external perpetrator. In a January 1997 CNN interview, conducted just weeks after the incident, John and Patsy Ramsey spoke broadly about their belief in intruder, pointing to physical clues like the disturbed basement window and the ransom note as evidence of an outside threat. DNA was scarcely mentioned, with John instead highlighting the family's cooperation with authorities and their emotional distress. Similarly, in interviews with the Boulderly Camera and other local outlets throughout 1997, John sidestepped detailed discussions of forensic evidence, including DNA, and leaned heavily on the ransom note's implications, suggesting it was written by someone with a personal vendetta. His reticence about DNA during this period was striking, as he appeared more comfortable discussing tangible items like the note or the condition of the house, which aligned with the intruder theory he and his legal team were beginning to craft. This approach suggested that John either did not view DNA as a critical component of their defense or was strategically avoiding it, perhaps aware that the early DNA findings were inconclusive and could invite scrutiny rather than deflect it. As the investigation progressed into 1998, John's public comments remained focused on deflecting suspicion from the family, but DNA still played a minimal role in his narrative. During interviews with national outlets like Good Morning America, he emphasized the family's victimization and the need for broader suspect searches, often referencing the work of private investigators hired by the family, such as Lou Smith, who was developing the intruder theory. When pressed about forensic evidence, John would pivot to general statements about the police's mishandling of the case, criticizing their focus on the family rather than exploring external leads. In these discussions, he rarely brought up DNA specifically, instead allowing his legal team, led by attorney Linwood, to handle technical aspects of the evidence in closed-door negotiations with authorities. This pattern continued through the grand jury proceedings in 1998-1999, where John's public statements, as reported in Perfect Murder, Perfect Town by Lawrence Schiller, centered on the emotional toll of the investigation and the need for justice, with DNA mentioned only in passing as part of a broader call for thorough evidence analysis. His reluctance to spotlight DNA suggested a calculated approach, possibly reflecting an understanding that the DNA evidence at the time, small, potentially contaminated samples, might not withstand rigorous scrutiny or could inadvertently draw attention to other incriminating details. The shift in John Ramsey's public stance on DNA became evident around 2000, coinciding with the publication of The Death of Innocence, the book he co-authored with Patsy. In promotional interviews for the book, such as on Larry King Live in March 2000, John began to explicitly reference DNA as a key to identifying the perpetrator, marking a significant departure from his earlier reticence. He described the DNA as evidence that could point to an unknown male, aligning with the intruder narrative championed by Lou Smith. This shift was not spontaneous, it followed the grand jury's 1999 recommendation to indict John and Patsy, which, though not pursued by Dalek's Hunter, intensified public and media scrutiny on the family. The growing pressure from accusations, particularly those targeting Patsy for writing the ransom note or Burke for involvement, likely prompted John to pivot toward DNA as a shield against these allegations. The intensification of John's focus on DNA gained momentum after 2003, when Bode Technologies analysis refined the UM1 sample, confirming its presence on both the underwear and leggings. In interviews with outlets like ABC News and The Oprah Winfrey Show in 2003 and 2004, John seized on these findings, repeatedly stating that the DNA did not belong to anyone in the family and was the path to finding the real killer. This marked a strategic escalation, as he began framing DNA as the cornerstone of the investigation, a narrative that dovetailed with his legal team's efforts to shift public perception. Lin Wood's aggressive media campaign amplified this message, with John echoing it in appearances on 20 to 20 and other platforms, where he called for advanced DNA testing to identify the intruder. The timing of this shift aligned with mounting public speculation, fueled by media reports and books like Steve Thomas's JonBenét Inside the Ramsey Murder Investigation, which accused the family of orchestrating a cover-up. By championing DNA, John could counter these narratives, presenting himself as a proactive father seeking justice rather than a suspect evading accountability. The DNA's ambiguity, its inability to pinpoint a specific suspect, allowed John to keep the public and investigators waiting for a breakthrough, effectively stalling deeper scrutiny of the family. The suspicion that John knew the DNA evidence was largely meaningless, yet used it to deflect suspicion, stems from his initial indifference and the calculated nature of his later advocacy. In the early years, his avoidance of DNA discussions suggested an awareness that the samples, particularly the UM1 and degraded fingernail DNA, were too small or contaminated to provide conclusive answers. As noted in Foreign Faction by James Kohler, the DNA's mixed profile and potential origins from non-criminal sources like manufacturing limited its investigative value. Yet, as accusations against the family intensified, particularly after the grand jury's 1999 proceedings, John's pivot to DNA appeared designed to exploit its scientific credibility. By repeatedly calling for DNA testing in interviews throughout the early 2000s, he created an impression of transparency, while knowing that the evidence was unlikely to yield a definitive suspect, thus buying time for the family. This strategy was evident in his 2006 Dateline NBC appearance, where he urged authorities to follow the DNA, a refrain that shifted focus to an elusive intruder while sidelining questions about the ransom note's authorship or the family's behavior on the day of the incident. John's emphasis on DNA also served to align with the intruder theory, which gained traction due to the presence of foreign DNA that could be attributed to an unknown male. In a 2008 interview with CBS News, following the DA's public acknowledgement of the DNA's significance, John doubled down, describing the DNA as undisputed proof of an outsider's involvement. This narrative was particularly effective because the U1 DNA found in multiple locations lent credence to the idea of an external perpetrator, especially when contrasted with the lack of familial DNA matches. By focusing on this evidence, John could steer public discourse toward a hypothetical intruder, reducing pressure on the family and inviting speculation about suspects like John Mark Carr, who falsely confessed in 2006. His media appearances, carefully orchestrated with Lin Wood's guidance, consistently framed the DNA as a waiting game, promising answers that never materialized, while deflecting attention from inconsistencies, such as the staging-like appearance of certain injuries or the family's access to the crime scene. This approach kept the investigation in a holding pattern, with John presenting himself as a grieving parent advocating for justice, even as the DNA's limitations suggested he was aware of its inability to conclusively resolve the case. The evolution of John's public statements about DNA, from near silence to fervent advocacy, reflects a strategic response to the mounting suspicions against his family. By the mid-2000s, as media scrutiny and public theories about Patsy or Burke grew, John's focus on DNA became a deliberate tactic to shift the narrative. His interviews, such as those on Dr. Phil in 2016, consistently highlighted the DNA's potential to identify an intruder, a message that resonated with audiences but avoided addressing the broader forensic picture, including fibers from his shirt or the unexplained presence of a flashlight. This selective emphasis, coupled with his early disinterest in DNA, fuels speculation that John recognized the evidence's limitations but used it to prolong the investigation's ambiguity. By keeping the focus on an unattainable DNA breakthrough, he effectively reduced pressure on his family, allowing the intruder theory to dominate while other evidence, more challenging to explain, faded into the background of public discourse. From the very beginning, John Ramsey believed the investigation had turned hostile in a way that went beyond simple suspicion. He often described the Boulder police as being so convinced of the family's guilt that when evidence appeared which contradicted their theory, it wasn't celebrated as a breakthrough but hidden away. In January of 1997, when a laboratory returned results showing that an unknown male's DNA had been found in JonBenét's clothing, it should have changed the entire trajectory of the inquiry. The tests excluded John, Patsy, and Burke completely. Yet the police withheld that information from the district attorney's office for months. John would later remark that if the case ever went to trial, the very first question any defense attorney would ask the detectives on the stand would be, "Whose DNA is this?" They had no answer, and that silence would have collapsed their case against the family. To him, the decision to keep the DNA secret was proof of how far investigators were willing to go to protect their own narrative. Years later, when Mary Lacey became district attorney, she pulled the case away from the Boulder Police Department. She ordered new DNA testing and, in 2008, announced publicly that the Ramsey were officially cleared. That statement was extraordinary in its own right. Prosecutors almost never declare suspects exonerated in such direct terms. For John, it was overdue recognition that the DNA evidence mattered. But for the police, it was another embarrassment, and instead of conceding, they looked for ways to reduce the significance of the results. Officers began suggesting that the unknown DNA might have come from a factory worker who handled the underwear in production. Others floated the idea of contamination at some point in the chain of custody. John saw this as a deliberate strategy to downplay the strongest piece of evidence in the entire case, a desperate attempt to cling to their original suspicion rather than admit they had been wrong. He would even recall hearing of proposals from within the department to spend resources traveling as far as China, supposedly to track down the origin of fibers or clothing materials, as if chasing the most remote possibility was easier than acknowledging what the science already showed. The secrecy extended beyond the lab reports. John claimed that for periods of time the police actually blocked the district attorney's office from accessing complete forensic files. That meant even the prosecutors were not fully briefed on what the evidence showed, a remarkable situation that deepened John's conviction that the police were manipulating the process. To him, it was not a matter of mistakes or inexperience, but an intentional suppression of inconvenient facts. The effect was devastating. Rather than investigating broadly, the case remained trapped inside a narrow tunnel vision. Alongside the mishandling of DNA, John pointed to the way the police attempted to fracture his most important relationships. On the morning of December 26, Fleet White, his closest friend, had been one of the first to arrive to help. Fleet was there out of loyalty and shared grief. Yet John later said that at some point the detectives took Fleet aside for hours, and when he came back, something had changed. The friend who had been supportive suddenly carried himself differently, distant, even suspicious. John described it as bizarre. That was the beginning of the end of their friendship, a bond that had been strong enough to withstand ordinary pressures, but not this. John came to believe that the police had deliberately poisoned Fleet's perception of him. He suspected they had told Fleet that John himself considered him a suspect, planting the seed that the Ramseys were turning on their own friends. At the same time, detectives would hint to John that Fleet might have been involved, seeding mistrust in both directions. It was a crude but effective form of psychological manipulation, a classic divide and conquer tactic. If they could isolate John from his allies, they could increase the pressure, make him more likely to confess to something he had not done, or at least weaken his ability to defend himself. For John, that sense of betrayal, engineered or not, cut deeper than the suspicion of strangers. In the aftermath, John tried to repair the damage. He wrote a letter to Fleet, assuring him that he had never believed he was responsible for JonBenét's death, and explaining that any suggestion otherwise must have come from the police, not from him. But the letter didn't heal the rift. Fleet never came back into his life, and the friendship that had once been a source of strength simply disintegrated. John carried that loss as one more injury inflicted by the investigation. Looking back, he framed these experiences as proof that the detectives were not just investigating, but actively working against him. They had hidden DNA evidence that cleared his family. They had leaked and twisted information selectively to the media to reinforce their case. They had created suspicion between him and his closest friend until the relationship collapsed entirely. And when new DNA tests again confirmed the presence of an unknown male profile, Instead of acknowledging it, they looked for ways to dismiss or explain it away. The combination of those actions left John convinced that the Boulder Police Department had crossed the line from investigation into obsession. Their suspicion of him had become so absolute, so entrenched, that even when science offered them a different path, they refused to take it. Instead, they concealed results, manipulated narratives, and undermined his friendships. For John, the real tragedy was not only that his daughter's killer remained unidentified, but that the very people charged with finding the truth seemed more determined to prove his guilt than to follow the evidence where it led. Until now, the question remains is how long can John Ramsey keep this narrative going? In recent years, the investigation into the JonBenét Ramsey case has seen renewed focus on the processing of DNA evidence, driven by advancements in forensic technology and persistent public interest. Since 2020, the Boulder Police Department and other agencies have prioritized re-examining existing DNA evidence using modern techniques, particularly genetic genealogy, which has proven effective in solving other cold cases. In 2020, discussions between the Ramsey family and BPD highlighted the potential for genetic genealogy to identify the source of the unidentified male DNA found at the crime scene. John Ramsey, the victim's father, publicly advocated for this approach, emphasizing its success in cases like the Golden State Killer. However, progress was initially slow due to bureaucratic hurdles and limited funding, with BPD citing resource constraints as a barrier to outsourcing advanced DNA testing to specialized labs. By 2023, momentum began to build. Reports from local news outlets indicated that BPD had started collaborating with external forensic experts to explore new DNA analysis methods. These efforts focused on retesting trace DNA samples, including those found in critical areas, using enhanced touch DNA techniques capable of detecting minute biological material. The hope was to generate a more complete genetic profile that could be uploaded to public genealogy databases for familial matching. John Ramsey met with BPD officials in early 2023 to discuss these developments, expressing cautious optimism that the department was finally taking steps toward leveraging cutting-edge forensic tools. He also proposed crowdfunding to cover the costs of private lab testing, though BPD declined, citing concerns over procedural integrity and potential conflicts of interest. In 2024, significant strides were made in the re-examination of physical evidence. A November 2024 report highlighted that BPD had sent several items from the crime scene to the Colorado Bureau of Investigation for reanalysis. These items included clothing and other materials not fully tested in the 1990s due to technological limitations. The CBI employed next-generation sequencing, which allows for the amplification of degraded or low-quantity DNA samples. This process aimed to the partial DNA profile from the original investigation, potentially making it compatible with genealogical databases. Public pressure, amplified by a Netflix documentary released in late 2024, pushed BPD to provide updates, with the department confirming ongoing cooperation with national DNA experts. John Ramsey, in a December 2024 interview, noted that these efforts marked the most significant progress in years, though he remained frustrated by the slow pace. The year 2025 brought the most promising developments to date. In January, BPD announced that dozens of previously untested or under-analyzed items from the crime scene were undergoing rigorous examination at these advanced forensic facilities. These included objects from the basement where the crime occurred, which investigators hoped could yield new genetic material. The use of genetic genealogy remained a focal point, with BPD reportedly consulting with private labs experienced in this method. At CrimeCon 2025 in Denver, held in September, John Andrew Ramsey, JonBenét's half-brother, shared that the family had met with BPD for a productive discussion lasting 30 minutes. He described the meeting as a step forward, noting that the department seemed more open to external expertise than in previous years. The family also launched a petition to align Colorado's cold case protocols with federal legislation, specifically the Homicide Victims' Families' Rights Act, to ensure greater transparency and access to advanced testing. Throughout 2025, media coverage underscored the renewed focus on DNA. Reports from major outlets confirmed that BPD was prioritizing the creation of a genetic profile for comparison against national databases like GeneMatch and Family Tree DNA. Unlike earlier efforts, which were hampered by the limitations of 1990s technology, these tests utilized high-sensitivity equipment capable of analyzing degraded samples. The CBI's work also involved cross-referencing existing DNA with new samples extracted from previously overlooked evidence, such as fibers and other trace materials. While no breakthrough suspect identification had been announced by September 2025, BPD's chief issued a statement reaffirming the department's commitment to exhausting all forensic avenues. This included exploring probabilistic genotyping, a method that interprets complex DNA mixtures, which could be critical given the small quantities of genetic material available. Public and familial advocacy continued to play a significant role in pushing for progress. John Ramsey's call for federal intervention, including a direct appeal to the U.S. President in early 2025, highlighted the urgency of applying genetic genealogy comprehensively. He argued that this approach, now a standard in many cold case investigations, could definitively resolve lingering questions about the unidentified DNA. BPD, while acknowledging the potential of this method, emphasized the need for rigorous validation to ensure any findings would hold up in court. The department's cautious approach stemmed from past criticisms of mishandled evidence, which had complicated earlier phases of the investigation. By mid-2025, BPD had expanded its collaboration with forensic genealogists. Though specific details about the labs or methodologies involved remained confidential to protect the investigation's integrity, the ongoing DNA analysis has also sparked discussions about the ethical and legal implications of genetic genealogy in cold cases. Experts involved in the case have noted that uploading DNA profiles to public databases raises privacy concerns, particularly for distant relatives who may be unaware of their connection to a criminal investigation. BPD has reportedly worked with legal advisors to navigate these issues, ensuring compliance with state and federal regulations. Despite these challenges, the consensus among investigators and the Ramsey family is that genetic genealogy offers the best chance for a resolution. The family's persistence, coupled with advancements in forensic science, has kept the case in the public eye, with regular updates in 2025 signaling a shift toward more proactive DNA processing. As of September 2025, the investigation remains active with no definitive suspect identified through DNA testing. However, the combination of retested evidence, new forensic tools, and increased cooperation between BPD, CBI, and private labs marks a significant departure from the stagnation of earlier decades. The Ramsey family continues to express hope that these efforts will finally yield answers, while BPD's public statements reflect a renewed commitment to resolving the case. The focus on genetic genealogy and advanced DNA analysis underscores the transformative potential of modern forensic science, offering a pathway to clarity in one of America's most enduring mysteries. Whether these efforts will lead to a breakthrough remains uncertain, but the progress made in recent years represents a critical step forward in the pursuit of justice. Overall, one key factor is the nature of the DNA itself, which is present in trace amounts, often referred to as touch DNA. This type of DNA can be transferred through casual contact, such as during manufacturing, handling, or even post-crime processing, and does not necessarily indicate the presence of an intruder. Forensic experts have noted that the small quantity of DNA, measured in picograms, is highly susceptible to contamination, especially given the less stringent evidence collection protocols of the 1990s. The crime scene was not immediately secured, allowing multiple individuals, including family members, friends, and first responders, to move through the area, potentially introducing extraneous genetic material. This raises significant doubts about whether the DNA is directly linked to the crime or merely an artifact of environmental transfer. Physical evidence at the crime scene further undermines the idea that the DNA is definitive proof of an intruder. The absence of clues of forced entry, such as broken locks or windows, suggests that the perpetrator was already inside or had access to the home. A basement window, often cited as a possible entry point, showed undisturbed cobwebs and debris, indicating it was unlikely used. The presence of a ransom note, written on paper from within the house and using a pen found on the premises, points to someone familiar with the environment. Handwriting analysis, while inconclusive, has leaned toward connections with individuals close to the scene rather than an unknown outsider. The note's content, including specific details about the family's finances, suggests a level of personal knowledge inconsistent with a random intruder. These elements collectively shift focus away from the DNA as the sole or primary indicator of guilt, emphasizing instead the contextual clues within the home. The crime's physical staging also casts doubt on the DNA's significance. The garrote used in the murder was crafted from materials found in the house, including a paintbrush from a nearby art supply. This improvisation suggests a perpetrator who did not arrive prepared to commit a murder, undermining the narrative of a premeditated act by an external actor. Additionally, the victim's body showed signs of being repositioned or cleaned, which could have introduced or altered trace DNA. Forensic analysis of the scene revealed no fingerprints, footprints, or other biological evidence definitively pointing to an outsider. The lack of such corroborating evidence weakens the argument that the DNA belongs to the killer, as one would expect additional traces, such as hair, skin cells, or blood, from an intruder engaged in a violent act. Instead, the scene appears tightly contained within the household, supporting theories that the perpetrator was someone already present. Investigative oversights in the initial response further complicate the reliance on DNA. The crime scene was compromised early on, with multiple people handling objects and moving through the area before it was properly secured. This increased the likelihood of cross-contamination, particularly for touch DNA, which can transfer through minimal contact. For example, clothing or items touched by investigators, family members, or even during transport to forensic labs could have introduced the unidentified DNA. The absence of a clear chain of custody for some evidence items adds to the uncertainty, as improper storage or handling could have mixed genetic material from unrelated sources. These procedural errors, common in the 1990s when DNA technology was less advanced, mean that the unidentified DNA may not be a reliable indicator of the perpetrator's identity, reducing its weight as the cornerstone of the case. Behavioral and circumstantial evidence also points away from the DNA being the key to solving the crime. The timeline of events, based on forensic reconstructions, suggests a narrow window for the crime, making it unlikely for an unknown intruder to enter, commit the act, and leave without detection. The complexity of the ransom note, which was unusually long and detailed, implies a level of comfort and time spent in the home inconsistent with a fleeting intruder. Moreover, the lack of subsequent similar crimes in the area, or by an individual matching the DNA profile, weakens the theory of a random attacker. Psychological profiles developed during the investigation have consistently leaned toward someone with a personal connection to the victim, further diminishing the DNA's role as evidence of an outsider's involvement. The limitations of the DNA evidence itself also contribute to the argument that this is not a DNA-driven case. The genetic material is a partial profile, lacking the robustness needed for definitive identification without additional context. Even with advancements like genetic genealogy, the small quantity and potential contamination make it challenging to draw conclusive links to a suspect. Forensic experts have emphasized that DNA alone, without supporting physical or circumstantial evidence, is insufficient to build a case, especially in a high-profile investigation with multiple variables. The focus on DNA has, at times, overshadowed other compelling evidence, such as the domestic context of the crime scene and the absence of external traces. This has led some investigators to prioritize reevaluating the physical and behavioral clues over pursuing the DNA as the sole path to resolution. Ultimately, the case's complexity lies in its reliance on a single piece of ambiguous DNA evidence against a backdrop of more immediate, tangible clues. A lack of corroborating evidence for an intruder, combined with the domestic nature of the crime scene, the improvised murder weapon, and the compromised initial investigation, strongly suggests that the unidentified DNA may not hold the answers. While advancements in forensic technology continue to offer hope for clarity, the broader evidence points to a scenario where the perpetrator was likely already within the home's orbit, making this less a case defined by DNA and more one rooted in the intricate details of the crime scene and its context. The ongoing challenge for investigators is to balance the pursuit of genetic leads with a holistic re-examination of all available evidence to uncover the truth. To sum up, the hypothesis that John Ramsey deliberately orchestrated the contamination of DNA evidence to obscure any prior sensitive mistreatment of John hinges on the notion that he recognized the DNA's inherent limitations and exploited them to craft a narrative that deflected scrutiny from his family. This theory posits that John, aware of the DNA's inconclusive nature due to its small quantity and potential for contamination, used his actions to muddy the forensic waters, ensuring that any biological evidence could be dismissed as unreliable. By allowing a chaotic crime scene to unfold, he may have created an environment where extraneous DNA could obscure any incriminating traces, thereby shifting the investigation toward an elusive external perpetrator. This calculated move, critics argue, leveraged the scientific allure of DNA to redirect public and investigative focus, transforming a complex case into a seemingly straightforward quest for an unidentified intruder. John's early disinterest in DNA, followed by his strategic pivot to championing it, supports the idea that he understood its ambiguity and used it as a shield to protect his family's reputation. John's shift to emphasizing DNA in later interviews suggests a deliberate strategy to capitalize on its narrative power, knowing it would sustain public intrigue without yielding definitive answers. By framing the DNA as the key to solving the case, he could keep the investigation in a perpetual state of anticipation, delaying scrutiny of other evidence that might point to sensitive mistreatment within the family. This approach aligned with his broader public relations campaign, which portrayed the Ramseys as victims of a bungled investigation rather than suspects. Critics contend that John's actions, permitting contamination and later advocating for DNA testing, were not about seeking justice but about creating a distraction that diffused suspicion. The DNA's presence, particularly the unidentified male sample, became a convenient focal point, allowing John to steer attention toward an external narrative while downplaying inconsistencies that could suggest prior sensitive mistreatment. The suspicion that John knew the DNA was meaningless stems from his initial reluctance to highlight it, only embracing it when public pressure intensified. This shift, skeptics argue, reflects a calculated understanding that the DNA's mixed profile and potential for innocent origins would prevent it from conclusively implicating anyone. Yet its complexity would keep investigators and the public preoccupied. By fostering a narrative centered on an intruder, John could mitigate accusations of sensitive mistreatment, using the DNA's ambiguity to maintain plausible deniability. His actions, whether intentional or not, effectively ensured that the case remained unresolved, with the DNA serving as both a scientific dead end and a powerful distraction. This hypothesis, while unproven, underscores the tension between John's public advocacy and the forensic reality, suggesting a strategic manipulation of evidence to protect his family from deeper scrutiny. The unresolved case surrounding JonBenét Ramsey serves as a stark lesson in the pivotal role DNA evidence can play in shaping the trajectory of a criminal investigation, while also highlighting the dangers of allowing it to dominate to the exclusion of other critical clues. DNA, with its scientific aura, holds immense power to sway public perception and legal strategies, often becoming the focal point of high-profile cases due to its perceived objectivity. In this instance, the unidentified DNA found on the victim became a linchpin for narratives that shifted suspicion away from certain individuals, illustrating how such evidence can redirect an investigation's focus, sometimes at the expense of a broader, more holistic approach. The emphasis on DNA, while compelling, can create a tunnel vision that overshadows equally important behavioral, circumstantial, or physical evidence, potentially stalling justice. This case raises a critical question: does an over-reliance on DNA evidence risk distorting the truth, especially when its limitations are not fully acknowledged? The allure of DNA lies in its promise of certainty. Yet this case demonstrates how its ambiguity, due to contamination risks or inconclusive profiles, can complicate rather than clarify an investigation. When DNA is elevated as the ultimate arbiter, other evidence, such as inconsistencies in statements or contextual clues, may be sidelined, wasting opportunities to explore alternative leads. This imbalance can allow strategic narratives to take hold, manipulating public and investigative focus while leaving critical questions unanswered. The case prompts reflection on whether an obsession with DNA's scientific weight can inadvertently obscure the truth, particularly when its presence is used to craft compelling but unproven stories. Should investigators and the public demand a more balanced approach, where DNA is one piece of a larger puzzle rather than the sole lens through which justice is sought? Moreover, the case underscores the ethical and procedural challenges of prioritizing DNA without rigorous safeguards against contamination or misinterpretation. When a crime scene is compromised, DNA's reliability diminishes, yet its prominence can still dominate discourse, as seen in the intense media focus on this case. This raises a troubling question: what happens when the pursuit of a single type of evidence drowns out the voices of other forensic or behavioral indicators that might tell a fuller story? The lesson here is clear. While DNA can be a powerful tool, its dominance must be tempered by a commitment to integrating all available evidence. Only then can justice avoid being swayed by the seductive simplicity of a single scientific narrative. How can we ensure that future investigations balance the promise of DNA with the complexity of human behavior and circumstance, preventing the waste of vital clues in the quest for truth?